Good evening, everyone. I'm Kelsey Forrest, and I'm here tonight with Dark Journalist Daniel Liszt to go deep into the mystery surrounding the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination and some fascinating breakthroughs that will take us directly into NASA and the covert world of exotic technology.
Yeah, it's really, really great to be here with you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's really what it comes down to, which is what is this exotic technology all about and how does that relate to this anniversary? So I'm glad to be here speaking with you about it.
Yes. Are you ready for all of my questions
I
for you?
know, you have a lot. So
Okay, I'm going to grill you. The 60th anniversary of JFK's speech about a joint moon mission with the Russians and the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination is an eerie echo across time. Why is it that we still don't have the answers from public institutions?
this is exactly the question after 60 years. And you started with a cover up in the government on November 22nd, 1963. And you can imagine those people thought at the time something very strange just happened in the public. And the answers that they got were very superficial. As time wore on, the story about Oswald and the old gun up in the sixth floor of the school book depository became kind of a punchline and a joke, the magic bullet, and things of this nature. And here we find ourselves at this point in culture looking across 60 years later, and those people who thought, well, at some point this will get resolved. You know, we've had parents and grandparents, and in their lifetimes they didn't see it, and now here we are 60 years later, and their kids and grandkids haven't seen it. So whatever the government has locked up in relation to the Kennedy assassination must be a secret that goes to the very heart of the power center itself, and that's why we find ourselves here 60 years later without
Still waiting.
any answers. Yeah, isn't that something?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And for me, you know, it's important too when you think about the generations coming up, because a lot of them, you know, I mean, the Kennedy story was already long, long time ago by the time I was growing up. So think about people now, you know, and I had to be retro enough to log into it as a story. So at what point is it just going to be something where if there aren't any answers, you know, they're hoping people just forget
Yeah.
about what took place?
Drop off.
Yes.
Yeah. What was the aspect of President Kennedy's space program that was called Blue and related directly to this hidden exotic technology?
This is exactly what we're here for tonight,
Yeah.
which is Blue. And Blue is the secret space program. It's something we brought forward on the X series. And for me, when I think about Blue, the discovery of it, all along the way when I was looking into the UFO file, the UAP, all this thing, the information that was coming out, you'd always go back to the names and they always had Blue in them. Project Blue Book, Project Blue Beam. And I thought, you know, we do a lot with steganography on the show. It's actually the X steganography series. And steganography is like cryptography. They use names for a reason, especially to move things through government agencies without anyone catching on. And so Blue, in particular, a program called Blue Gemini happened during the Kennedy administration. And this was Kennedy's attempt to open up and sort of take control back under the executive wing for the space program. And it had fallen into the hands of Project Paperclip scientists over at NASA. So there was a battle and a struggle there. And a lot of those documents have only come out really in the last 10 years. So we haven't had the access that we have now. Now we can really say that there was a secret space program. The code name of the program was Blue, and that the Kennedy, you know, the kind of battle inside of those political structures with President Kennedy was directly related to this exotic technology aspect, which was in the hands of a very elite group of scientists who were operating outside of any kind of idea of law or constitutionality, and who were very rabid anti-Russian. And so they didn't want anything to do with sharing the technology for the world the way that President Kennedy did.
Barely anyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, well, that's the kind of thing where we see that now too. You know, there's a lot of exclusive circles that happen.
Was NASA involved in a cover-up that persisted 60 years later. I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, this is interesting because NASA comes up as two different things on the radar. And just like Blue Gemini, the program I mentioned about President Kennedy, trying to bring out to the public, Blue Gemini is interesting because it's a twin. And so NASA itself has that twin quality to it, where on one hand, it's supposed to be scientific, they're supposed to be exploring other planets and this kind of thing, but it had a military function even very early on. And the people who were embedded in it, for example, setting up satellites and things like that, there was a division called the NRO, which the public didn't learn about for 30 years. So that's the National Recon Office. They ran the satellites. Well, who was up there? I mean, it's NASA. So we've got a lot of secrecy and heavy-duty secrecy up there in terms of what the public is funded through the space program. This is what President Kennedy was getting at 60 years ago. And what we have now, which is largely an entire apparatus in space that doesn't have anything to do with the public. So they tell us certain things, but they have an infrastructure going on in space that has nothing to do with what they've presented publicly. So it's really, I would call it the privatization of space. And that's, SpaceX and Blue Origin. It's the billionaires in space game. And so that's kind of the trajectory that we're on, which it gets pretty dangerous, actually, after a while.
Yeah. Well, especially the unknown part, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then what's being hidden.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why was this aspect of JFK's secret space initiative program expunged from the official record?
There's a lot to do with the Kennedy administration, which didn't see the light of day until recently. And the main aspects of the records are still being held back. There's 5%, and they've said, well, we've let 95% out, leave us alone. The problem is they left all the good stuff in the 5%. So
makes it sound good,
yeah.
95%.
Exactly. Well, you've got almost everything.
Yeah.
Just not the smoking gun,
Yeah.
literally in this case. So we have a lot of tensions when it comes to space and the kind of secrecy that's held. Problem is that the agencies that hold that information, NASA, the CIA, the NRO, the NSA, they aren't used to doing things without a lot of public pressure. And so the name of their game is counterintelligence. And counterintelligence is, we'll give you a false story, and that's how they're trained to take on our foreign adversaries. They give them false stories to lead them astray. But when it comes to hiding the institution, then they get into a whole ball game where they're looking at it and saying, you know what, we've solved this a long time ago, and we had this lone nut assassin, and he killed President Kennedy, and President Kennedy, he was all about the moon landings, and he was really into that aspect of space. And this part they feel they can just leave out because they don't want anyone to dime into this whole idea because it's a secret space program. So we can think about it as a kind of a covert operation, and we have the public overt government struggling with it. So you have two factions operating side by side there, and space seems to be the ultimate secrecy.
That's a lot to think about.
It really is, yeah.
What exactly is X technology and the X tech black budget?
Black budgets are interesting. There's a story out of a Michigan newspaper in 1987 that reveals the black budget. And this was a very well-organized journalist who brought this forward. And basically he was like, here's the regular military budget, and here's the part that doesn't have any oversight. And the part that didn't have any oversight, nobody knew because there was no oversight. So when you have all these kind of thousands of dollars disappearing from particular projects, when you added them up, they came into billions.
Wow.
So they'd have a thing like if you go back into the records, you'll find in the Reagan and Bush administrations, they had things like hammers that cost $10,000 and stuff. That's all of this kind of racketeering and putting the money into this black budget. Problem is, where was that money going? And so they had access to information, and they were operating with that information from a totally different level than what we were getting in the public. So that's the black budget. X technology is the thing that they are hiding from the public. And I'll give you an example. There was a
Yeah.
scientist who came on the show, and he was telling me, well, you know, the stuff that they came out with for computers, let's say around 2012, we already had those in 1968. So that's, you know, almost 50 years of a technology leak to the public. So we can imagine the levels of technology and the degree of that technology and how advanced they are.
Yeah.
So when we think about where we are now and the things that they tell us, oh, you know, the great problem is nuclear war or oil or whatever. I mean, there are breakthrough energies and things that they've studied that they're already 50 years out. And that goes into space as well with the discoveries they've made. They're only leaking that stuff out a little bit at a time. Oh, you know, we found a water crystal on the moon of Mars or something. They certainly are a lot more advanced than that at this point. So the X technology is something that has been developed and hidden over the course of 75 years. And that's something that operates inside the government, but it's very difficult for you and I to get access to what it is. But you could call it, you know, when they have those hearings relating to the UFO file, and they have these whistleblowers come out, and the whistleblowers say, well, you know, we've heard about this program, and there was this crash, and we redeveloped these things. Obviously, with the UFO story comes into the X technology, but it's not a kind of mutually exclusive thing. It could be advanced technology that's homegrown right here, which is beyond the regular public culture, or there could be something here from somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, when you find that $10,000 hammer, let me know.
I know. It's going up on eBay. It's interesting.
From himself. So, Daniel, who seized control of the X Black budget in 1947 through the National Security Act to create a governmental mechanism finding private corporations take over advanced exotic technologies?
It's that exotic technology again, isn't it? And this is fascinating because 47 is the year. This is the key year if you study it. So we're 76 years out. So we've been living under that system. But that system brings in the National Security Act. And what's interesting with the National Security Act is it was fought over by factions within the White House. And that's Harry Truman, is the same guy who dropped the atomic bomb. But he didn't like this. He said, well, you know, that's like an American Gestapo creating the CIA and creating these different kind of eavesdropping powers. And the problem with the National Security Act, they needed something to prevent all the spying and everything that was going on. But they went too far. And the CIA, if you look at the setup of the CIA, you have two organizations. One of them is the OPC, which it has this incredibly innocuous title. It's the Office of Policy Coordination. But these guys blow up trains, you know, rig elections, and they do assassinations. I mean, so like policy coordination indeed.
What a nice title.
It really is. The OPC is that function inside of the national security structure that starts to operate outside of constitutionality. And then the CIA gets memos from President Truman saying, get this OPC thing under control. You know, they're going over to Italy, and yeah, we want help with the election so the communists don't get in, but they're like, you know, completely fixing the election. And it's fascinating because he's sending them memos to get the OPC under control. And what happens is the OP merges into the CIA. And when they merge into the CIA, they become the dominant factor. So instead of the CIA gathering intelligence for the president the way that Truman originally decided this was to be done, suddenly we're in a totally different ballgame. And the guys who like to overthrow governments, the guys who, you know, if you're against them politically, will assassinate you, those guys get in power inside of that structure. So when President Kennedy comes in, his first thing that he says is, I can't believe the amount of power the CIA has over the presidency. This is ridiculous. And he's quoted by Arthur Schlesinger as saying, I'm going to take the CIA and smash it into 1,000 pieces. So you can see instantly that that covert world is looking at this guy who's come in, who's a millionaire, you know, and they think, here's this lightweight playboy. And, you know, he thinks that he's going to change all the things that we've been laying out in terms of the rule of the world since World War II. And so it's that structure that turns on him. And it's about 3 years of President Kennedy's presidency. That's all he has. And most of that is fighting with the CIA
Yeah.
and the different things that they're doing. So when he leaves, we're in the Vietnam War. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they want him to go in and bomb Cuba. So Kennedy he's already developed quite an enemies list on the CIA side. So therefore, when you get into the situation where the public's looking for disclosure, so many years later, the CIA is the obvious place to go, but they're the ones who've kept the records back.
At the same time.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yes.
So it leaves us in a tricky situation where the same people who are covering it up still, the CIA, it's interesting because they've had investigations over the years. They said, oh, you've done torture, you've been in Iraq, you did torture things, and a slap on the wrist, a few guys get fired, but the CIA has blown up and blown up. They have their own Air Force, When you look at some of these agencies, you wonder about the national security aspect versus the kind of just oppression of free constitutionality. Because take Homeland Security, which didn't even exist until 9/11. So Homeland Security has 250,000 employees. So just think about that stretched across. We didn't even have the Homeland Security. So in 20 years, 250,000 employees.
Yeah.
So the intelligence agencies and their contractors become a very difficult aspect when you're looking from the point of view of trying to get at the truth, because they're masters of obscuring that kind of truth.
They've been doing it for so long.
Yes, right. They're experts at it.
Yeah.
And so counter intel, right? It's a good secondary story. If the public doesn't believe the first one, I do counterintelligence, And so that's kind of, I think, where we are now.
Okay. Well, over 75 years and trillions of dollars later, how has this story evolved into what you refer to as X-Protect and the Breakaway Civilization?
Yes, very interesting. So there's a number of names, the Breakaway Group. X-Protect is something that we put on the record. The Deep State is another one. Professor Scott, who's a UC Berkeley professor, so it's very interesting, the combinations of people who see this power structure, because they're on the left, they're on the right, they're in the middle. There is no political bias involved. So the Deep State, some people call it Mr. Global, and X-Protect is a group that I've studied that looks over the UFO technology, and they keep it out of the public realm. And they've had that job for 8 decades. The Breakaway Civilization is the same concept, and this is actually brought to the fore by a CIA doctor who worked in the remote viewing program. He's a very interesting guy, Kit Green. And the remote viewing thing gets into psychic viewing and all the things the CIA were doing in those experiments. We've had Russell Targ, who ran the program, on the show talking about this. And they have a very deep interest in UFOs on the CIA side. But this program, Kit Green said, well, they've built a breakaway civilization. And then this idea of the breakaway civilization is because they have advanced technology, then you move into other areas. They have advanced science. They have, because the way that science works generally is one guy gets, his great breakthrough and then somebody else picks up on it. But if you're doing all that in a narrow corridor where only a small group operates with it, then you're going to miss all kinds of things. So you have a small group operating with advanced technology. That sounds like a bad, unhealthy thing in a democracy, right? Yeah. And this is kind of the problem that we run into with it. But if it is a breakaway group, what's happened is they've developed the technology over these 8 decades, say, since the 40s. And it's funny, we were talking about that year 1947.
Yeah.
You've got the development of the CIA. You also have Roswell. You have the development of the whole flying saucer, meme. Kenneth Arnold sees flying saucers, and suddenly all this stuff is established in 47. It's an interesting year. But we come back around to this idea of the breakaway. Now they're at a point where they need to break back in to they've developed this advanced technology. What are you going to do with it? You can't
Yeah.
just sit on it forever, right? So you're going to come back to the public with it, but you have to come back with a story. So a lot of people look for disclosure and UFO disclosure. They call it UAP disclosure now. They have a new name for this, but UFO really is the best description of the whole thing. For me, the story that they're putting out about it is how they get back into it. So it's not, so they roll these guys out and they're intel related again. So they're giving us kind of intel whistleblower knowledge. They're not genuine inside whistleblowers. So that's kind of false disclosure, sideshow. That's the kind of the upshot of the whole thing. In my opinion, what we're looking at is a group that has such advanced technology, needs to roll it out, needs to profit from it, but doesn't really know how to explain how they kept it secret for 80 years while the public funded it and they kept it completely off the books. So that's not, that kind of transparency isn't something that they can allow. So we're in this situation 60 years later, which is the same thing that Kennedy faced in 1963. So he goes behind the back of the State Department and the CIA, and there are memos now that came out about President Kennedy saying, I want to share our space information with you, the Russians. I'm going to share our UFO file with you, and we're going to go to the moon together. There's going to be no space race, no weapons in space, none of that. And Sergei Khrushchev, who's Khrushchev's son, he goes on the record saying he and my dad, were planning this joint moon mission.
Wow.
Now, at the Kennedy Library, they have the documents that say cooperation with the Russians in outer space. That's 10 days before the assassination that he's giving
Wow.
these directions. So you can see we're in the same tug of war, and it relates again to the system that's operating plus space. So it's like this very uneven combination with not a lot of questions answered.
Yeah.
And this is where we are
Yeah.
as we sit here tonight
Yeah.
on the 60th anniversary.
Oh, it's so wild. Is the government missing trillions of dollars relating the space program, and what do you think happened to the money?
That's really a good question.
Where's
because
the money?
on the record, it's $23 trillion missing. That's a lot.
Wow.
But some of the researchers around are like, oh no, it's 3 times higher than that. But what they can prove, they have a guy, Professor Mark Skidmore,
Okay.
and he's the University of Michigan professor, and he goes and he assigns his student after he hears about this. And we have a guest on our program who is the Assistant HUD Secretary. She was for many years, Catherine Austin Fitz, and she has been tracking the missing money for decades. And Skidmore was like, I don't believe it. The government can't be missing that kind of money. The Pentagon, are you kidding me? So he sets his students to do it, and he finds there's more money missing. So Fortune magazine and like mainstream publications start tracking this. Where is this missing money? And so between NASA, HUD, and the Pentagon, they cannot find $22 trillion, which is quite remarkable. So therefore, that's going out the back door into the development of some kind of system. And for me, it relates directly to this heavy-duty development in space that we're seeing and the privatization of space. Because it doesn't make sense. There's only so many Ferraris you can buy.
Yeah.
And like fancy houses you can buy. 22 trillion?
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty severe. So where is the money going? I think my best guess after looking at it is that this is all directly space related.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Daniel. NASA had enlisted through Project Paperclip Nazi rocket scientists like Werner von Braun, who developed the V-2 rockets in Germany during World War II to help create the United States space program. How did this relate to the secrecy around the technology?
Yeah, this is the crux of what we're talking about with secrecy,
Yeah.
because the program itself, Paperclip, was not widely known until the 70s, many years after it happened. So after World War II, the Allies go in, and the United States in particular want the cream of the crop of the Nazi scientists. And von Braun is the top of the rocket program. And he, along with someone else named Walter Dornberger, who shows up in relation to JFK later, those are the two that are kind of the cream of the crop of the space program. And in fact, when they get them back as Paperclip scientists They're reformed Nazis, basically. And they developed NASA. They developed our whole space program. And so Wernher von Braun, he's the father of NASA, but he's also an SS Nazi. You know, it's a very interesting set of circumstances when we
Yeah.
get into that. And I think they did a lot to say, well, you know, he was under, you know, Hitler and all that, so he couldn't really, you know, express his true desires, and he didn't want to drop V-2 rockets on English citizens, but that's just what Hitler made him do.
Yeah.
But we used those guys to build our space program, but then we also developed them into all kinds of different aspects of the government, and this is where it becomes problematic, because Paperclip as a philosophy, the kind of martial philosophy they're bringing with them from this Nazi period. You can imagine, well, they worked under Hitler for 12 years. By the time we get them, are they really going to be, you know, pure and
Yeah.
suddenly just pro-America? So a lot of weird things happen when we get the Paperclip Nazis into the American system of government. But their key function is the space program. And so what you see happening there is they start to develop aspects of this breakaway inside the space program because they've reunited their old command structure inside of it. And technically, you know, they're under the umbrella of the American government, but how much do they want to basically get back to just running the world the way that the Nazis
Yeah.
were? So there's a lot of that philosophy, there's a lot of crossover there. How much were they really after American interests? And with von Braun in particular, this is somebody who I would say, when it comes to Kennedy, Kennedy's policies about sharing the secret technology with the Russians, about going to the moon together, a joint space mission, that's anathema to somebody like him. I mean, the Nazis have just killed 25 million Russians. So, you know, they don't want anything to do with a joint program with those guys. And so Kennedy becomes more and more of a target with his vision of doing this. Kennedy also is looking for, ultimately, UFO disclosure. That's what figures into the equation here. So Paperclip becomes then kind of a dark shadow over the American government.
So fascinating.
It's, yeah, I know that's the disturbing aspect of the whole assassination part, because you have him dealing with, you know, dyed-in-the-wool Nazis in NASA, and they have a lot of problems with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The thought that we are governed by a covert technology group that sees themselves as directly separate, which has gathered vast wealth to finance their operations on a clandestine basis, that may be managing crafts as part of a secret space program, and which is outside of any public oversight, is not a pleasant one. How do we get to the real truth?
It's a really good point. This is really the nature of the problem that we find ourselves in.
I'm so curious what you have to say.
Well, we're in a tight spot with this, I think, because they have collected vast amounts of wealth around the secrecy. So the idea of getting any kind of transparency from the government under traditional circumstances or from the media, you know, they don't have the incentive to do it because they're protecting a structure which makes them tremendous amounts of money, like the 22 trillion that's disappeared off the books. So it's not a comforting thought, because how are you going to retake control from that covert government back to the overt government? And we see this struggle through history. Professor Scott, Peter Dale Scott, he coined the term the deep state. And he's one of my favorite authors, and he's been on the show many times, but he talks about deep events. So when we get into things like, you know, the world crisis that we're in now, or 2000, you know, September 11th, or Watergate, or Iran-Contra, all these things, the Kennedy assassination, he calls them structural deep events. And what they do is that group that's operating on that covert side walks into the public, and they commit some crime, or they change some policy through their action, and then they step back into the shadows of that covert program, and the overt public is left dealing with the policy change that they've created. So with the Kennedy assassination, they got the Vietnam War, for example. And through Iran-Contra, you know, there's all kinds of money that went into programs that were secret. That's the kind of heightened development of the black budget. So when you get into it at that level, what you're looking at is a structure that's operating completely outside of any constitutional bounds or outside of any rule of law that we've
Yeah.
established in America, and yet using American assets to do it. So the struggle is between the public, regular, overt government that we live in every day, American justice, all the rules that we live under as a country, and then this other system, which has vast amounts of wealth and operates completely outside of the system.
Pretty rogue.
It is, yeah. We're right. I mean, 2023,
Yeah.
It's prime time
Yeah.
for this. But a lot of people are seeing it too, and you're probably finding it more in day to day that people are more aware
Yeah.
on a certain level, and they're probably more freaked out in a way too, That's kind of how I see it in the public. There's a disturbing thing of like, oh, they haven't played straight with us. And I think the Kennedy assassination, it's interesting because when you look at it over the arc of time, it's almost like the alpha and the omega of the secrecy, because we're still living with it, and you're supposed to have, you can look back on this and say, well, they were fighting the Cold War, and here are the CIA people who were involved in the assassination. But instead, you're still getting the official narrative of Oswald and an old gun, and and the magic bullet and all that nonsense. So I think that we have to take a look at ourselves in society and say, right now, secrecy rules.
Yeah.
And how do you get to the other side of it? How do you get to disclosure and genuine disclosure? And it gets into things like the UFO file, the exotic technology. So much of the economy depends on those advances. So in a sense, I guess the people who are operating that are way ahead of us, and until, we start to develop policies that rein them in,
Yeah.
we're in for more of the same.
Compliance.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And more so, like I'd say 10 years ago, it was much less than it is now. And again, 20 years early, even with all the things that went on, if you go back and really look at how people were living, the idea, like there's more censorship, and at the same time you have the internet development, and you have the whole free speech aspect under siege. So you have all these people with a voice and all of these corporations and structures trying to silence them.
Yeah.
So it's an incredibly tense period in history.
Very. How does a secret UAP file and the recent congressional hearings on unknown aerial aircraft fit into this?
This is fascinating because in the past few years, what's happening with the government is they're saying, oh, there are UFOs out there. We call them UAP now, unidentified anomalous phenomena. And they're coming up with different committees to study it. Now, what's so funny about this is they've had access to the technology, to the different reports, all their pilots who've seen this stuff, probably crashed vehicles and everything else, for 8 decades. So they know everything there is to know about it. So this idea that, hey, we need to study this, there's something weird going on. But I'll tell you how this crosses into where we are now.
Yeah.
If you look at the beginning of 2023, they had this whole thing with the Chinese balloon going across America. And they made up all these weird excuses like, oh, we didn't see it. And it's weird because I went in and I studied what is the laws pertaining to balloons. And they had a law on the books, national security, from World War II, because Japan used to float these poisonous bombs across the West Coast, and nothing that's a balloon can get anywhere near the United States without them taking it out. So the official news stories about the Chinese balloon were all bunk, because of course they saw it, one, they can see anything through NORAD. You're not going to miss a balloon.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that once they saw it, they let it go right across the United States. Then later, they had the NORAD commander come out and say, we shot down UFOs over Canada and Alaska. they use the term UFO. And the New
Yeah,
York
I was
Times,
just going to mention. Huh.
so, they're putting something in the public's mind there about it. They didn't need to use, and they've never ever suggested that before. They used to be in total denial mode. So what if we now kind of walked into Alice in Wonderland, moving into, this whole thing where they're talking about the stuff that they've kept hidden for 80 years, but they don't know quite how to bring that conversation out to the public, especially in a way that's still advantageous to them.
Yeah.
So we're in a weird place with that. But I remember looking at that New York Times headline and thinking, they're saying UFO shootdown? This is remarkable.
Yeah.
And it's almost a casual thing. So when they got to the summer hearings that we had, and they had this guy, Grush, who came out of the NGA, and all the CIA people coming forward and saying, oh, I saw all this stuff. I don't think much of the whistleblowers themselves. I think that they're doing counterintelligence. But I do think that it's remarkable that we're in this era where they're bringing things forward on a congressional level. Think
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
I mean, they got rid of congressional hearings in the 60s on UFOs. So why are they bringing all that back? It tells you a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are the two kinds of UFO disclosure in modern society?
Right. So you have the CIA false disclosure narrative, which comes out of the NSA, the NRO, the NGA, the DIA. They all operate on a counterintelligence basis when it comes to these very highly important subjects. So we had a physicist, they had this Oppenheimer movie out recently.
Yeah.
And there was a guy who was around in the same period named Robert Sarbarker. And he was right up there with Oppenheimer. They had him on the cover of Time magazine and all this. And he said back then, oh, well, the UFO issue is above the atomic bomb issue in terms of secrecy. And that got him kind of blackballed in that period of time. Later, he comes back in the 1980s, and these UFO researchers are like, hey, you made all these comments in the 50s. And he said, oh, yeah. And not only that, but we had people who ran the UFO file, and he named the people who were involved. Vannevar Bush was the scientist who was involved in setting up our science, for FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower. And he said, oh, he had it, and then he passed it on, and he gave the whole lineage of who ran the UFO file. And he died shortly after that, but he was in his 70s for sure. But what's interesting to me about that story is the secrecy level of the UFO aspect is above nuclear. So think of what they do to protect it. I mean, and you could say, well, there was a study actually, the Brookings Institute did a study in the 1960s about the effect of if people knew that extraterrestrial life was out there. What would it do? Yeah. Would it destroy religion and things of this nature? And when they looked at the details in that, they decided, oh yeah, we couldn't reveal this even if we wanted to, kind of thing. And so this is kind of the excuse that they've used. But they've studied the public at different points in time and said, what happens if we reveal this, basically?
Are they ready?
Yeah.
So, question for you. Why is there such a wall of secrecy around the UFO issues?
Well, that's the ultimate question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. What you have is a subject that people are familiar with through entertainment, through family stories, through the military. They had, flying saucer movies in the 50s, right?
Dreams, even.
Yeah, exactly. You had guys like Carl Jung writing books about UFOs 60 years ago. So what is the problem here? And what you're looking at is if it were genuinely a situation where they said, well, there's extraterrestrials and we don't want you to know about that, and that's why we have the space program being secret, and then that would be one thing. But it's hard to imagine after they've conditioned the public for 60 years that they would continue to hold that back. So something is amiss in that explanation. A lot of problems show up because they used to deny it just across the board. And now they have this kind of partial disclosure going on. So the soft disclosure. Oh, we're seeing something. Our planes, might bump into it, so we have to have a safety thing. They know, after 80 years of study, quite a lot about the phenomena. In fact, if you go really into it, it goes a lot further back in terms of study. There's actually, programs from the 19th century. So you're going back into the airship mysteries, and there are all these reports of these airships in 1890s. So what are those? Who's operating that? Mm-hmm. That's where you get to the breakaway idea, more than like the UFO ET idea, because somebody here has already developed a technology. So in some of the research that I've done, we've looked into the Cosmos Club. And the Cosmos Club is a DC secret club. And now it's a little bit more open because people know what it is. But they started that as far back as the 1870s. And so we have these centers where people get together, and so they have this Bilderberg meeting where all these groups get together and nobody can talk about it. But on the UFO side, where do they go to make those decisions? So when I looked into the Cosmos Club in DC, I found all the major players on the UFO side, J. Allen Hynek, Project Blue Book people, and the people who had developed the different programs, and also who came out as the naysayers. So you had things like the Condon Committee, and this guy comes out and says there's no such thing as UFOs, don't worry about it, and the Air Force says, oh, well, if he says there's no UFOs, then there isn't. So they had that wall of secrecy. That was one way of how they did it in that period. But if you look at what they're doing now with the partial disclosure, it says we still can't let out the real truth, but you can have this version of it, which is there's some kind of a threat. And so they developed a UFO threat office. I kid you not, this is what they have, AARO. It's a UFO threat office. It's funded every year, millions of dollars. And it was developed by a Republican, Marco Rubio, in Florida, and a Democrat, Kirsten Gillibrand, both senators. She's out of New York, and she ran for president in 2020, actually. These people run it, and it's literally to get a UFO defense budget to defend us against a UFO threat. So their thing is, we'll make a funding corridor for this. Instead of giving you what we've developed over 80 years, we're going to just come out with this funding corridor for this program. That's an official government program, and they changed the name 4 times leading up to it. And when they couldn't get it through, they did a very interesting maneuver, which you don't see in politics very much. They attached it to the National Defense Authorization Act. That's what controls all the defense money everywhere. So everyone's waiting for that $1 trillion to come down the pike. And if you block it, if you're on a Senate committee and you say, no, you have to add my UFO defense office to it, then nobody gets any money. So they were like, all right, we'll take your program. So it was like a weird blackmail.
Yeah, really.
And that's the nature of the type of situation we're in with it. So the UFO thing operates on an incredibly disingenuous and intel-driven narrative front, so that the stories that we get about it don't add up, and in terms of what the government has and what they say they're doing for honest transparency in relation to it. So they have a totally different agenda, and it goes back all the way back to the Kennedy era, oddly enough.
Yeah.
And Kennedy is weird on that because he has a lot of UFO connections long before he goes into the White House. So James Forrestal is the first National Defense Secretary. He is his close friend. He takes him to Berlin after the war when he's a 28-year-old journalist. And what's fascinating for me is they're both Catholic and they're best friends. And Forrestal runs MJ-12, which is, overseeing UFO secrecy for the government. He ends up getting thrown out of a window at Bethesda Hospital.
Oh my gosh.
This is Defense Secretary. And Kennedy is his best friend. When Kennedy gets into the White House, he does a very interesting thing. He goes and visits the grave of Forrestal, and he has a photographer come with him to take pictures of him at the grave of his friend Forrestal. And we can take a look at that picture right now.
Yeah.
Von Braun and JFK, that is 10 days before JFK's assassination. And he's there with the head of our rocket program, Von Braun, who is the leader of the Paperclip group.
Yeah.
Very strange indeed, but quite a picture for the ages.
Yeah.
And not one that they traditionally show when it comes to the Kennedy specials and
Yes.
things. They don't want to deal with Paperclip.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Interestingly enough, there is more and more coming out in terms of, they keep the documents around the Kennedy thing. But in other ways, documents are coming forward that suggest, oh, there were people who were around in this period, right around the assassination, and they kept their records sealed tight for 60 years. And now some of that stuff comes out around the Kennedy thing, and you start to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are government hearings on UAP leading to public disclosure of hidden technologies, or is it a part of an ongoing cover-up?
Yeah, I don't think, it's interesting with the committees. I'm glad that they have UFO committees, but it doesn't seem to me that they're leading in any direction. They seem to be saying, oh, we don't know what it is, but give us more money to fight this threat, this potential menace from outer space. It's interesting, during the Trump administration, they had the Space Force, and people still don't understand how remarkable it is that we got this thing, because it's very strange to get the Space Force at this point in time. All these other presidents didn't do it. And then you look at somebody like Trump and you're like, why the Space Force? Like, what is this about? And we spend billions of dollars on it every year. They already had various space missions and departments that handled space. So what was this about? But I think when you track through these different periods, it happens with Reagan in the 80s with SDI and Star Wars. It happens later in the late Clinton administration. He's having meetings with Lawrence Rockefeller. And Lawrence Rockefeller is very openly, he supports UFO researchers. So he's very, he's the odd Rockefeller. He's the guy who wants to fund the wild stuff. But what's interesting to me is it seems like on a presidential level, since Kennedy, they understand there has to be something done to pull the UFO information back under the executive branch. So Kennedy here, 10 days before his assassination, he sends a memo saying, I want to share this. And you can look at the memo. It's a publicly available document. It's not anything secret. And it says, I want to share our UFO file with the Russians, and we're going to do this joint moon mission. And when you look at that, and you think about what they'd been doing there with the tension at NASA, with the Paperclip scientists, and then you say, he's trying to communicate with Khrushchev at that period of time, and they have all these blocks against him doing it. So what Kennedy does is something very unusual. Maybe he learned it from his dad or something. But he starts to develop a human intelligence network. So this guy is in a cafe, he's reading a newspaper in Washington, D.C. He represents President Kennedy. Someone comes in and puts something into his newspaper, and it is a message directly to bring over to West Berlin. The guy takes a plane to West Berlin, and then from West Berlin, he goes to Moscow. From Moscow, he meets with the Khrushchev representative. Khrushchev's representative gets the message, goes back, and this is how they're doing diplomacy. There's no State Department, there's no CIA, there's nothing. So I think when they were looking at Kennedy on this, they were thinking, he wants to share this exotic technology through the UFO file, and he has his own secret network of communicating back and forth. This is outside of everything that we've developed. By the way, the guy wants to destroy and dismantle the CIA. So I think at that point he becomes too much of a problem for the national security state. And I think that's how we ended up here. And so when they have the hearings now in 2023 about UFO, UAP, and they're saying, oh, we're trying to get that disclosure for you, if they don't deal with Kennedy's effort 60 years ago and the fact that he, one of the factors in his removal and in the animosity from the intelligence agencies is over this aspect of the hidden technology, then we have a situation which you'll never get any kind of answer. And all you'll get is, oh, we need to fund all this money and bloat the Defense Department even bigger because there's some anomalous threat and we can't tell you exactly what it is. So, yeah, that is the nature of the situation. And it doesn't sound like, free world media in 2023, but there you are.
Yeah. So with that said,
How do you top that?
exactly. um, what is the space economy, and how does it represent a challenge to democracy and freedom around the world?
This is interesting about the space economy because it's not something that's put really front and center right now. You know, I mean, people are thinking about other things, but we have this incredible apparatus in space. So they've recently talked about converting the entire currency system into a central banking digital currency that's run from space. And, you know, using the same blockchain technology that created Bitcoin. So the only problem is that rules in space aren't the same thing as operating out of the Constitution or, you know, any kind of lawful thing that we have around the world in terms of democracies. So you have an entire infrastructure being developed up there. So much of space already operates when it comes to in low Earth orbit, everything that we do, from driving to running the various internet things that we do. I mean, we are really looking at a space-based economy in development. Problem is, if you look at it in terms of the relation of what happens now versus how we got into this situation. So we end up stopping the moon missions, manned moon missions, in 1972. And so you get 51 years later, and they still haven't gone back to the moon with the manned moon mission. It's very strange because you had a whole space architecture, a whole space development. So what happened to it? So you can see that the secret space development plays right into this whole picture because you have 50 years of development, they privatize it, and then they announce, well, guess what? You know, everything's run from space now, and we have the centralization, and then you get Elon Musk as the space president.
Yes.
I mean, that's where you're going, right?
Yeah.
Where else can it go from there? So this is the nature of the danger of the thing. And you do have one guy, you know, if you study Howard Hughes, and then you look at Elon Musk, it's like they practically cloned Howard Hughes' situation and created Musk, because who's had that much power as a single individual, except for Hughes, really.
Yeah.
And, you know, they've got somebody who's developed SpaceX, but he also took over Twitter. He's also, you know, with Starlink, lending, you know, getting involved in war zones and things like that. And so we have...
Twitter isn't even Twitter now.
It's not, right. Well, it's X.
It's
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So that puts us in an interesting place.
Yeah.
But the space billionaires, that whole class, Bezos and Branson and our friend Musk, they're operating with the X technology. If you look at Blue Origin, Bezos is always using X. SpaceX, of course. Now X, he wants X.com to be the everything app, right? So there's some appreciation for it, but what does that really tell you?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's some kind of communication that I have X technology, you have X technology, you know, and they're in competition with it, but that's kind of the way that they operate with it. And you could say, well, X, the unknown, whatever. But it's interesting because if you go back to how the FBI categorized the UFO file in the beginning, they called it X. And that's where the whole thing about the X-Files, the TV show, and all that came from. It's, you know, this is the FBI definition for it. And it's weird because the people involved all go back to Kennedy, and that's what really intrigued me over the years, is whenever I would go into searching out NASA or the UFO file, Kennedy always showed up. So in the case of X, they had someone named Guy Bannister who was a field agent in the FBI, and he became the chief of their Chicago office. This guy created the X-File, and he researched the cases. There's like newspaper shots of him with, you know, somebody who saw a UFO. So he's the early development guy. He's the same person who in 1963 in New Orleans is training Lee Harvey Oswald, who they're going to say is the Kennedy assassin, to infiltrate student groups by pretending to be a Marxist. And they say, well, you know, really act like a communist, and we're going to weed out who's a communist, because Bannister himself is super right-wing. So what's interesting is Oswald, as the assassin figure, he gets set up doing all this. And so by the time they grab him in the Texas School Book Depository, he has this incredible record of acting like a Marxist because he's been working for this guy, Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is the one who developed the SMX, X technology protocol for UFOs. So it's a weird interface
Yeah.
between these people. You start to feel like they're an interlocking network,
Yeah.
shall we say. And the odd thing that shows up in biographies of Oswald, which people still can't explain, is when he's working, stacking books for $1.25 an hour at the Texas School Book Depository, he's telling everyone, I'm going to work at NASA. This is what they remember. They're like, well, he said he was going to get a job at NASA. So we missed an important chapter of who this guy was.
Yes.
He's supposed to be this disgruntled guy who hates the United States and he loves communism, and he's just so lucky that President Kennedy drives by his window and Oswald gets to shoot out the window. It's perfect timing, right? Oswald only had the job for 6 weeks. So what are the odds of him getting into this building,
That
hating
moment.
it doesn't seem very likely. Whenever you go back into that historical aspect of the story, it gets more and more ridiculous. And the UFO aspect is interesting whenever you get around the Kennedy case. You're looking at the first murder case of a president that was Jim Garrison was the guy who prosecuted the murder of President Kennedy, and he kept running into all this weird aerospace parts. He's like, well, this is supposed to be an assassination by, this communist who hated Kennedy for his policies, but now everyone I'm running into around this guy is an aerospace person, and they work at McDonnell Douglas, or they work at NASA, or he says he's going to work at NASA. So this is all part of the problem with the case, which is the aerospace side has been ignored for a long period of time. And if you don't study the aerospace side when it comes to the Kennedy assassination, you miss out on two major things in terms of public disclosure now around the UFO file and then around the Kennedy assassination, which is aerospace is sitting right in the middle of it, and the aerospace interests. So Garrison, after he presses the case, he decides, and it's a very famous interview that he does with Ramparts magazine, which was like Rolling Stone back then. And he says, originally I thought it was Texas Oil men, but what I learned was that the aerospace companies had their own wing of assassins, and they were the ones who put together the assassination. That was his conclusion, and he was the guy who prosecuted the case. So yeah, we're in a remarkable situation there where the person who prosecuted, and they made the movie JFK out of Garrison's life, which is where we get all the different congressional hearings and things about Kennedy in the 90s. And Oliver Stone makes the movie about Garrison. But Garrison is the guy who said, you know what, the aerospace companies were the ones that were involved. And the reason that they did it was, this is the great question that he had. Why did they do it?
Yeah.
And I think if you put together that research with the UFO research, then you start to say, oh, Kennedy is a threat because he's exposing their pet project, the ultimate exotic technology project. So that puts him, you might say Kennedy was on the radar to be assassinated for a number of different reasons, but the aerospace aspect is the aspect that you can't ignore.
Yeah. Yeah.
60 years later, records are still held up.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's interesting because it's the Garrison records that they're holding. So, I think that tells you a lot.
Yes.
No question.
Yeah. But here's a question. How is the new push for a super advanced AI-driven technological cashless society through the central bank digital currency related to the space economy?
That's that's the key question, which is, so CBDC is what they're trying to roll out.
Okay.
All these major central banks. So the idea is you'll just have digital currency, no paper money anymore. You flash your iPhone, that's it. And it's all fine and well. There's only one problem, which is if you are a political dissident of any nature and that structure doesn't like you, what do? They shut off your money. So that's a problem. And we saw during the Canadian truckers thing, one of the ways that the government in Canada got those people to stop protesting was they shut off their money, and people who were contributing to them, they shut their money off too. So we can see that that structure is more for an authoritarian
Yes.
regime, and doesn't, it's not just the friendly, hey, we're moving from paper to digital
Yeah.
currency, because then you are removing a lot of choice. So you're getting into a very problematic territory. The fact is, JP Morgan and other companies are trying to set up that cashless society by housing it in space. And this is the interesting thing that's going on about data in space, which is that infrastructure now, they're going to have satellites controlling those things. And when they look at it, they say, well, it's outside of the bounds of traditional jurisdiction. The laws don't operate the same way. So we're putting too much into the centralization of a space government. So therefore, when you get into things like artificial intelligence, when you get into things like CBDCs and the kind of digital era that we're in, you're giving up so much of what has been developed. There's a reason why so many countries threw off the oppression of kings and all the rest of it, and now here we are developing a kind of space serf dynamic where the royals are up there in space, and guys like Bezos say, our descendants are going to live among the stars. Well, it sounds like it's an idealistic idea, right? But really, it's that, hey, we're going to rule from up above. And it's funny because, you can easily see how they get into that situation where they start to think of themselves as gods, because a guy like Musk, he's like, oh, I need to make sure that our consciousness survives to Mars. Who elected Musk God? It's ridiculous,
Only him.
Right.
Sorry, Elon. I'm sure you're watching.
We need to talk to Grimes about Elon, right?
Oh, okay.
I don't even remember how that one started, but that was very interesting. That's the moon speech. And see, that's Johnson over his shoulder. And it's interesting because Johnson, it's come out recently that Kennedy was not going to include Johnson on the 64 ticket. He was going to choose Terry Sanford of North Carolina. So there's a lot now after the fact saying, well, Johnson may have known about his assassination because he didn't want to get dumped from the ticket or go to prison, which is the other weird thing about Johnson, which is he was facing a lot of legal trouble before he got installed as Kennedy's replacement. So, you're surrounded by a lot of interesting characters when you're Kennedy. Geez.
Kennedy's Club.
Exactly. And look, like Johnson just looks sinister back there. I don't know.
Kennedy's much happier.
It's that Boston to Austin connection. Whoa.
Yes.
Things get weird in Texas. They do.
I'll take your word for it. Are you ready for my question?
Yes.
It's a big one. How does the continuity of government COG program fit into your research about the secret space program?
COG, continuity of government, that level of secrecy. First of all, most of what I know about COG I got from Professor Scott.
Okay.
And he studied it for years, and he was basically, this is a guy who was a diplomat from Canada and has been studying the government since the 1960s, pretty much. And he's 94 years old now. And the work that he put forward was basically continuity of government. COG was a program you couldn't even mention in Congress. And it got brought up in the 80s and 90s. If you go back and look at those clips, and they're like, oh, we can't talk about that. Go into executive session. And the idea is it's a gigantic underground infrastructure which is set up to survive a nuclear disaster and still have a government. So if the government gets decapitated, you've got a whole structure here that's ready to roll underground. So they built a gigantic thing with malls and everything else down there, and people live there. They grow up, live and die in the continuity of government. And Mount Weather is what we know of it publicly, which is, if anything really goes wrong, that's our nuclear bunker where the DC people go to. But COG was changed in 1988. So they removed the nuclear part and they said, well, it's not just for a nuclear disaster, it's for any emergency. So if we get into a war we don't like, continuity of government rules. So continuity of government is emergency powers, and it suspends the Constitution. So, we saw during, different crises, this would come up and they'd be like, well, during the COVID lockdown, they'd close businesses and things like that. That's one kind of just government emergency power control. And you could say, well, they had their reasons, for doing that. But if you look at continuity of government, they have those abilities of martial law for declaring an emergency. So on September 11th, 2001, they called in continuity of government. And they changed the rules around continuity of government so that they created something called NORTHCOM. And NORTHCOM is a military division which didn't exist until 2001. They created it to run the United States in the event of, they pressed the COG button. And what they did is they installed one general, and he heads up both NORAD and the Continuity of Government program and NORTHCOM. He's a 3-time winner. And that guy, if they were to call in continuity of government, would set up regional governors for the United States under emergency. So that's the ultimate power of COG. What they use it for instead is that Professor Scott noticed whenever we got into these deep political things, going all the way back to the assassination of President Kennedy, there was always somebody who had trained in the COG program at the heart of these deep events. So somebody, like Oliver North was one of the guys who set it up. And Dick Cheney was a big COG guy. As a matter of fact, he was a COG person even when he was out of government. So they would have him come in and like, this is how it's going to run when the main government is gone and you rule everything from this position. So it's like martial law fascism, but they have a good reason, which is, we have to do it because it's an emergency. So the rules of secrecy, I guess the main aspect of the problem with it is that the secrecy is so thick, there's no oversight involved with COG. So if you don't have any oversight, you can't really say what people are doing, how they're spending the money, and all the rest of it, or what they plan to do.
Yeah.
So you have kind of a separate operating society there. That's the whole breakaway group again. And when you apply those rules of secrecy to survive a nuclear war, and you flip them into space, you have the same thing that you can do. Well, I don't need to account for things. I can develop a secret space program. I don't need the accountability. So that's what the problem is when we get to COG. But I'm glad you mentioned it here, because COG has to be the crucial aspect for the way that governance is going to work going forward, because I don't think the different political figures can get the majorities that they need. And I think we're seeing that in the past couple of elections, where we're getting more and more into territory where somebody like Trudeau has 28% approval or something. And so we saw he used the emergency powers against the truckers, right? That's one small example, but Macron in France, he came across the situation where they said, well, you can't change the retirement age. And he said, well, we don't have enough money to fund all these people retiring early. And so they said, tough luck. And so he's like, well, emergency powers, I'm doing it. And he presses the button. So you're seeing emergency powers as an excuse more and more for things. And you might think, well, something's a genuine emergency and have sympathy with it. But then there are other situations where anybody can abuse it by just calling it emergency powers. So COG is probably the least explored aspect of our government in terms of what rules they operate under. All we know is that they suspend the Constitution. And every year with the National Defense Authorization Act, every president, whether it was Trump, Biden, Obama, Bush, they all acted the exact same way when it came to COG. They sign on to what? It's the same emergency powers that Bush signed us into on September 14th in 2001 after the terrorist attacks. But they're still doing it. There's no, we're not in 9/11 territory, but they still have the emergency powers. That's why COG is important. And it's funny because the 9/11 Commission, when they studied all that, they said, well, we still don't have any answers about COG because they said we don't have the clearance for it. Well, those are senators and investigators. How are you going to get clearance? Like, who gets the clearance then?
Yeah.
And so that brings us back to the secrecy question. That's just
It's
where
only
we are.
God. That's it. Yeah, so I'm interested on this question. How does this term you've coined, apotheum, relate to X technology?
This is, yeah, it's a kind of a shorthand. Apotheum is, it's something that when I studied what they were doing with the secrecy around the technology, it didn't make sense to me. I was like, you know, they would, if they were seeing things like ET out there, I think they could bring that forward to the public. There's something else involved. And the more that I studied it, I went back and looked at cases of what people said happened to them. And really weird things show up if you go back into the casebook around people who've had abductions and things like that. Or pilots who've seen things. So there's a Japanese pilot, and he's famous in the UFO world for having this incredible sighting, you know, going over Alaska. And he sees this craft beneath him, this incredible craft, and he's freaked out. They have all these radio tapes of it. But if you really look at his comments, what he says is, oh, look, I can see through it. So the thing is there and it's not there, right? So there's this idea of physical dimensionality. So apotheum, I think, is the thing that they're studying in the UFO file because I think that they feel it's completely uncontrollable. If you go into contactee cases, even Betty and Barney Hill, they're like, oh yeah, I'm being floated up into this ship. The classic cases, I'm getting floated through a wall, right? Well, if you take them at face value, as a UFO case, you can say to yourself, what could be happening for them to be doing that? So you're changing the dimensional level of the physics that they operate in. So apotheum is the thing that they're studying inside of the UFO file. It's some weird aspect that they get. And, you know, it's funny because if you study the story of Nikola Tesla and his technology, which was suppressed heavily, and you go into it, what you find is they did the same type of cover-up of his stuff as they did with the UFO file later. So whatever that apotheum effect is, there's a crisscross there where they think, oh, if this gets out, you know, we won't be in charge anymore. Like some other country will be in charge, or, you know, we can't make this common property. So I think that they're studying it. I also think when you think about those types of effects that suspend universal physics, then you're getting into territory where they're thinking to themselves, we don't know how to aim this thing, you know? So that's where I think X-Protect comes from, because they're safeguarding that whole range of exotic technology. That's where all those stories come from, even Men in Black stories. The whole thing, right? Federal agents, and that level of suppression makes more sense when you think of it, that what Sar Barker said all the way back there that I mentioned, which is the UFO file is above the atomic bomb. It's above nuclear secrecy. So then it makes sense. Then you're like, oh, well, you know, now I understand a little bit better how they're operating. The question is, how do you get them to stop with the secrecy?
Yeah.
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 And it is. That's a puzzle.
Well,
Major.
that totally leads me to, you've described two groups, one called X-Protect and one called X-Share, that oversee secret technology for covert military and intelligence units. What is the difference between these groups?
This is really interesting. X-Share then would be the opposite of the X-Protect group. And there's a whole swath of people, including President Kennedy, who I include in this. They want to move the culture forward. They want to get the technology out there. They want a way to explain it to the public. And they want to get out of that secrecy rules regime that we're stuck in. And what's interesting is when you look at Kennedy's struggle with the CIA and covert elements and what they're doing, and that includes things back then, even like drug running and all the different political takeovers that they were doing, he's really in a bind because he's about sharing the technology. He's about, you know, freedom, basically. What happens is that group decides, well, this guy is a threat on a number of levels, and they eliminate him. But I think a lot of the ex-share people were eliminated before we got a chance to really see what they could do, because they were more about bringing this aspect out to the public and felt the public could handle it.
Yeah.
So the guy that I mentioned earlier in relation to President Kennedy, which is Secretary Forrestal, he was appalled at the idea that they would hold back and not tell the public about the UFO file. Back then, that's the 1940s. And he's the guy who was thrown out of the window at Bethesda Hospital.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they called it a suicide. This guy's level-headed Secretary of Defense. He ran a major Wall Street firm for 20 years before going into government. And he just didn't have those types of problems. So, you know, it's a very strange case. And I think there's a thread there that you can really discern from Forrestal being close to Kennedy, Kennedy getting into government and seeing the layers of secrecy around the exotic technology development. So he's an ex-share character. Someone like Forrestal would be ex-share. But I think they're in the minority. But we have to imagine people on the inside who want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. They must exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Safety thing too, though, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
So who are some of the historical personalities involved in these groups?
That's a good point. Well, Forrestal,
Yeah.
for sure, is a major one. Thomas Townsend Brown, who a lot of his projects became black ops, you know, black projects. And those projects had to be hidden because of how advanced they were. But he was someone who openly studied anti-gravity, and he was somebody who in the 50s and 60s was really big on bringing this out to the public. A lot of the weird things that exist in the background there that you can still hear echoes of, experiments at the government, the Philadelphia experiment, you know, weird things. All of that stuff, if you go back to it, relates to Thomas Townsend Brown and his experiments. So he was somebody who wanted to bring that out. And when I talked to his daughter, she said, well, you know, what he did, he retreated to an island in the Bahamas and had like a huge security detail, because he was like, oh, you know, basically they want to use the technology I've developed for military purposes. And he cited things like the Rand Corporation when he talked about this. But I think that those figures are important, and I would put Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, his brother, the Attorney General, in that category of trying to move things forward. There's a guy who came out, Philip Corso, who was a general that came forward and said, I briefed the Kennedys on the UFO file monthly. And that a lot of the planes and the things that they were developing in a hurry in that period were because they wanted to study the phenomena. So this big push for space, and we get Kennedy, let's go to the moon and everything, it is, again, about asserting that UFO technology, that investigative wing, back under executive control, where at a certain point it was lost. And it was during the Eisenhower administration that it was lost to the intelligence agencies. So for me, you know, those stories, I think, hold up very well. And, you know, Corso, he'd been in the military for 50 years. So he had the background where you could really trust what he had to say.
Yeah.
But those people, in that period of time, it was very hard for them to come forward and say anything publicly without looking completely crazy.
Yes.
You know? And you still look a little bit crazy when you talk about it.
A little less, but it's still there.
Exactly.
But so you say that declassified documents and statements from retired government scientists show that the UAP issue is above the top secret level of the nuclear bomb. Why would that be the case?
See, that is fascinating. When you get into that territory about the secrecy level, so supposedly there's a physics involved when you get around unidentified flying objects. That's torsion physics. And torsion physics, you know, we have a guest on the program, Dr. Joseph Farrell. He said that torsion physics makes nuclear weapons seem like a firecracker. So you can start to imagine when they get into the UFO thing, they're looking at something which the level of secrecy it commands is beyond what we can imagine, plus the things that they've done to cover it up. So I think once in a while in the public, there's enough of a clash that happens over it. And so during the Reagan administration, when they had Star Wars, it was actually very odd. Just like Space Force is very odd. The Reagan administration had something called SDI, which they nicknamed Star Wars after the movie. And the Strategic Defense Initiative was supposed to be space-based blasters that would get rid of any nuclear missile on the planet. And so Gorbachev and Reagan go into their summit and they meet and they say, let's eliminate all nuclear weapons down to 0. And, you know, we'll get together and do this. And what happens is the Star Wars program they put together, it's a very interesting conversation that happens between them, because Charlie Rose is sitting with Mikhail Gorbachev in 2014. And this is a pre-sex scandal Charlie Rose. And he is talking in this press club in New York. And Gorbachev says, by the way, Reagan took me aside at Reykjavik in Iceland when we did that summit. And he said, if the UFOs attack us, will you help us? And Gorbachev said, of course. And Reagan said, well, we'll help you too. And he said, I'm not kidding. This is what he said. And Charlie Rose's face is like, he didn't know what to do. But that's Gorbachev talking. So in the 80s, they were showing Reagan stuff saying, there's this stuff flying, you know, doing tremendous things, large ships and all the rest. And they scared the daylights out of Reagan. And as a result of that, he developed SDI, this program, under the idea that we can zap any nuclear missile. But supposedly, the program was developed as like a UFO defense shield. So either they spooked him into thinking that by showing him, you know, the stuff that they were looking at and saying, well, it's menacing, you know. But I think that we see interesting things there. So Reagan shows up at the United Nations and he says, I wonder what we would do if there was an alien threat from outside this world. What do you think we would do? We would forget all our differences and unite and fight against it. So that's 1988, right? So Reagan is talking in public about it in this weird fashion. And so Colin Powell in his memoirs is like, oh yeah, Reagan kept putting this thing about the alien threat in his speeches and I kept taking it out, but that UN one, I missed it. So Reagan wanted to talk about something here, and he developed a program which was part of this advanced space program. So we have the 60s thing with Kennedy, you have the moon program under Nixon, and then by the time you get into the 80s, everything is about this, you know, weapons in space piece. So something changed. And by the time you get into the period that we're in, they don't even talk about it.
Yeah.
It's all privatization. We're going to run your money from space. You know, we're going to deal with satellites. You know, we're basically going to have Starlink up there running the internet. So I would say that we're in a huge deficit of knowledge in relation to this. So I think that's where we're at.
Yeah. Compliance, again.
Yes. That's a key word.
Yes. How is the UAP issue, SpaceX and Blue Origin, going to have an impact on the 2024 election?
This is the one.
I'm
telling you, yeah. In 2024, that election, what you have is already Musk has Twitter, so he's a big blowhorn.
He has
for the whole
X.
thing. He has X, right, let's get with it. And then you have Bezos and all the money that he's pouring into the election. We already know that Zuckerberg is pouring tremendous amounts in. So what's interesting, all through this, though, you have this weird push around, oh, we're going to have UFO hearings, we're going to have this UAP thing, rebranding UAPs, the CIA comes out with false disclosure, right? There's something very big in relation to this that they're working on for 2024. So Robert Bigelow, who is this, you know, huge space millionaire living out there in Las Vegas, he starts giving millions and millions of dollars to DeSantis. And he says, oh, I'll give him all my money to get this happening. Well, this guy is like UFO mogul central. He wants to build hotels in space. And he is one of those guys who's like a player on the space economy front. Why is he putting all this money behind this candidate in Florida? So there's already players involved there. But now let's go directly to the main candidates. Well, Biden as the president, I don't think that they're telling him very much about anything. Bobby Kennedy Jr. is in the race. There you have direct correlation to the UFO file through his family. How much does Bobby know about what his dad and his uncle knew? I mean, probably a great deal. Bobby's been on the show, and he's a very articulate lawyer, and he's an unusual presidential candidate. I don't think we've ever had anyone who's that honest before, and we'll see how far he goes. But then now let's get to President Trump. President Trump, his uncle, John Trump, well, first, he made the Space Force. As I said, that's unusual when looking at the secret aspect. And so when you get to Trump, he again was pulling that executive hat back, pulling the control back under the White House wing of the UFO file with Space Force. It's a weird tension that shows up. If you look into his background even a little bit, you'll find Uncle John Trump. Uncle John Trump went to MIT, was a professor there for many years, but he's the guy that they sent in to study Tesla's papers looking for Tesla's incredible X advanced technology. John Trump. So John Trump, his uncle, who he's close to growing up. So now you have Trump in these weird musing things during his campaign stops, and he's like, oh, my Uncle John, Uncle John. So Uncle John becomes this kind of like snapshot of, oh, Trump knows he's involved in this too, because Uncle John was sent in by the government to study the Tesla files. That's a weird connection, but you can see front and center the exotic technology through Bobby Kennedy and through Trump is just sitting right in the middle of it. And, I think guys like Biden, under his administration, you're seeing this weird slideshow going on in Congress. And when we get into that, there's a lot of UFO activity under his presidency that you haven't seen before. So they're all playing into this. So the UFO part, they're going to call it UAP or whatever. Yeah. It's going to be right dead center in the 2024 election.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Your eyes are going to be glued.
Yeah. I'll have to do a show every night. That's the thing.
You guys aren't going to believe this. So did the military develop advanced UAP technology, or was it retrieved from craft that were recovered and then re-engineered?
It's interesting. Yeah. Did we make it or did they make it? It's the ultimate question. The only thing I can suggest is that there's a third option in there, which is there was another group operating that had advanced technology that it was extraterritorial. It didn't belong to any particular government. And if you look at the stories that come in from the 19th century of the airship mysteries, there's an author called Walter Bosley who developed something called NIMSA. And he looks back into a German group that were very advanced and came over here to California and created something called the Sonora Aero Club at the end of the 19th century, before the Wright brothers, before all that. And that all of the airship mystery cases from that period are probably these guys experimenting with their craft. So I think you're looking at something that could be, therefore, human technology on one hand, something here from somewhere else on the other, and then the military itself, the incredible advances that they've made behind the scenes when it comes to the UFO file. So I think a traditional story is a crashed saucer happened in 1947, the military goes in and retrieves it, they recover all this technology from it, they become super advanced. That's one possibility. The other possibility is somebody like Tesla gives them that doorway and they develop this technology. But whatever it happens to be the case, there should be the possibility that the technology was already there and somebody was operating it. Yeah. Not large scale, but it was already in operation. That's why you get those stories. So somebody has it, and that's the idea of a breakaway then. At a certain point, they almost snub their nose at the public because they've developed the technology to a certain point where they kind of almost don't even, they say, well, I don't even need the public. Yeah. I can automate everything through robots, Yeah. So that's the danger. I would say. So when we say breakaway, I think it's a danger. It's kind of a dangerous concept because whoever they are, it's a small group with too much technology and too much power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, is Project Bluebeam, the so-called false UFO invasion scenario, something that still exists on some government military intel agency, or no?
That's a fascinating question. Bluebeam was always like the street legend that at some point, and it's a story that came out that at some point the UN was going to get together and stage a false UFO invasion. And it had been around since the 90s, pretty much. And but Bluebeam, again, there's that blue piece
Yeah.
inserted there. It hung around as a theme. Then, when you get into 2017, the New York Times starts covering these stories, and they're like, "There's a UFO threat. There's a threat here. Threat, threat, threat." And then they developed the UFO Threat Office. So then Bluebeam started to seem like, well, maybe it's a possible scenario. So could they bring it out to the public and say, well, there's this incredible threat, and we need to call in continuity of government, whatever it happens to be. We need emergency powers to deal with it, plus all your money.
And then some.
Yeah. So Bluebeam is, the technical name, like the street legend idea. And yet, now, when we look into it, we can see the disclosure programs over and over again. They're mentioning this threat aspect, threat. And for me, the threat thing is a dead giveaway that it's a counterintelligence meme that's meant to centralize power. The extent to which they would do it is anyone's guess. And it's interesting because Kennedy was concerned about this in relation to a nuclear emergency. So he funded director John Frankenheimer to make 7 Days in May. And 7 Days in May is about a COG commander who goes off on his own and creates war with Russia and shoots missiles over there, or he's attempting to, and that he removes the president. So the movie comes out after President Kennedy is assassinated, interestingly enough, and he gave Frankenheimer access to the White House in order to do this. And behind the scenes, when he was talking to people about it, he said, people need to understand how things actually operate and how dangerous it is with the groups that have taken on power to themselves. And what's really amazing is they have Burt Lancaster playing the general, the COG general. And I have this one clip that I've shown on the show where if you look in the background of where he is, he's giving this dissertation of how he's going to take over and everything. And right over his shoulder is Roswell, New Mexico. So it's this really weird steganography in this movie. And you think, people didn't even know what Roswell was. They didn't actually find out about that story till the 80s, even though it happened in the 40s. Because it was, it was this one intelligence guy who kept the secret for 40 years. So it's very strange, that movie, and that Kennedy would help Frankenheimer make it. I think it tells us a lot about the forces that he was up against, and somehow, again, the factors involved: exotic technology, space, and excessive secrecy. Over and over again, those three factors show up. That's dark journalism.
Okay. I like it. So, to circle back,
Yes.
you've encountered a link between the exotic technology program and Antarctica. How does this relate to JFK assassination and his final speech?
This is the thing that I'm bringing forward, which has never been on the record, and this comes directly from the Blue research that I've done.
Let's go.
Yeah. So Lloyd Berkner was the person that President Kennedy was going to meet at the Trade Mart.
Okay.
And the Trade Mart, on his way to the Trade Mart, he gets assassinated. So no one ever knew about what speech he was going to give. As a matter of fact, for 5 years, the speech was inaccessible, which is very odd. Eventually, the Johnson administration let it out and said, oh yeah, we think this was it. And it was some weird war speech about how we need more nuclear weapons or something. Kennedy would have never given a speech like that. So what speech was he actually going to give? Well, it's interesting, in Berkner's notes, there's a series of things, and I should explain that Berkner is an interesting guy. One, he's a major scientist for the government. Two, he had been in Antarctica with Admiral Byrd during the famous Byrd exploration to Antarctica. We have a number of secret projects involved in Antarctica. Deep freeze is the one that's most well known. But whatever it is we're developing there, people can't really get a handle on it because how are you going to get any real intel out of Antarctica? What is interesting is that Berkner had been in Antarctica with Admiral Byrd. And so Lloyd Berkner shows up as an odd character. The next place he shows up on the map is he controls the Robertson Panel, which is the first UFO examination by the government. They call in their top people. He's sitting right on the top of it. So Berkner, in 1963 at the Trade Mart in Dallas, he's the person President Kennedy is going to meet. And although Kennedy's records, and the speech were scrubbed, Berkner's notes have been unearthed. And what he said was the speech that they were going to give, one, was going to have international implications that were staggering. Now think about, Berkner and Kennedy going to meet him and all the things that Kennedy was doing with space. My suggestion is that it was going to be related either to a joint moon mission with the Russians or related to the UFO file. Because the kind of hubbub around the event, they were going to helicopter in a flag from the White House that had flown over the White House that Kennedy was going to present. This is from the White House notes. So there's only a couple of things on the record about it, but this you can take to the bank. He was going to hand the flag to Berkner before the announcement. And Berkner, his expertise was Antarctica and the UFO file. So that's pretty interesting when you get right down to it, when you're thinking about Kennedy himself. If you just boil it down to the day and what he was doing, he was going to the Trade Mart to meet Lloyd Berkner, Dr. Lloyd Berkner. And Berkner was major in the UFO file. So here's the strange thing about Berkner. Berkner, later on, will encounter this scientist researcher, James McDonald. And he'll meet with McDonald and one of LBJ's aides. They'll get together. And McDonald is obsessed with the UFO file. He wants to know where they've kept the secret records and did they bring everything to Wright-Patterson, all this kind of talk. Berkner has that meeting, and then 3 weeks later, he goes to D.C. He goes into a fast food place, has a hamburger, goes up to give a speech, and dies. So there's a lot of that type of activity around this subject. And, I think when we study Berkner's history, we're connected directly to Antarctica. So the thing that I found when looking for links with Antarctica and the Kennedy assassination is the weirdest one, which is that the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository, this is on the record, is named D.H. Byrd, and he's the cousin of Admiral Byrd, who discovered, did all the explorations to Antarctica. So D.H. Byrd, they called Dry Hole Byrd because of his oil explorations. He's the one who's funding all the Antarctica expeditions. So when you get into the assassination zone with President Kennedy, Lloyd Berkner has been to Antarctica and spent all this time with Byrd there. Kennedy's going to meet him. The person who owns the Texas School Book Depository, where they're going to sit this patsy in it, he's D.H. Byrd. He's Byrd's cousin. So there's an Antarctica stamp. And we had a guy on the program, John Warner IV, and he is the son of Senator Warner, the late Senator Warner of Virginia. And his stepmom was Liz Taylor. And his dad was a part of MJ-12, which is the committee that controls the UFO file. And he said, I tried to nail down my dad about what he was doing in Antarctica and deep freeze, because he would take me on all these different trips with him, but he would not take me to Antarctica. And he said, all I can tell you, son, is it's about space. So that's what we get when we go into Antarctica in relation to this. But there are people who are going on the record in relation to these things. And Warner, his dad was in a position to know. He was the Secretary of the Navy. He was the senator for 2 decades in Virginia. And, he went through that whole neocon war machine with Bush and Cheney and those guys. So, his public profile is kind of that of a hawk in a way. But there he was giving that intel to his son. I can't tell you the whole thing, but, you know.
Key word.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Liz Taylor was really into UFOs, by the way.
You learn
So
something
Warner
new every
says,
day.
can you imagine having Liz Taylor as your stepmom?
Yes. Ugh.
What a life.
Yes.
And you know, the interesting thing about Warner, his cousin, because Warner comes out of the Mellon fortune, so the Mellon banking fortune. And his mother is Catherine Mellon,
Okay.
John Warner. Here's the other interesting link with John Warner, our guest. His cousin is Christopher Mellon, who is the Defense Intelligence Agency guy who's been running the whole UFO threat meme through the public. He's out there saying, oh, there's a UFO threat. So he's running like the intelligence version of UFO disclosure. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Wow. So we get into weird territory when you get into the actual thing.
Yeah.
And you find some kind of big names involved.
Definitely. I'm still getting over all these.
The Mellons.
Yeah. What would you say is the difference between some of the terms you're using? So like breakaway civilization, X-Protect, deep state, and secret space program.
This is interesting because they all have some relationship with the UFO file. What I've found is particularly interesting is deep state, which Professor Peter Dale Scott coined. This is interesting. He said it's a combination of organized crime, intelligence power, and then the contracting groups like Booz Allen Hamilton around intelligence. So the CIA has a project, it'll get their hands dirty, they subcontract it out to Booz Allen Hamilton. Booz Allen Hamilton doesn't operate under the same sense of the law as a contractor agency. So we get into weird territory with the deep state. And then their higher levels are that control, financial control, and those who manage that financial control. So the deep state operates through the physical state. It's sort of a system that operates in a parallel basis. And you know, sometimes it's referred to as an iceberg. You can see the top, and it, you know, it's very hard, but underneath is this massive structure. The breakaway aspect of that is so interesting because I think that the group that developed and redeveloped this exotic technology, the UFO file, those are the guys that see themselves as separate. They think that they're advanced and they think they're going to become a spacefaring situation. And I think they have a real heavy influence on our political situation and in the media as well. So it's like, you know, they basically want the story to come out the way they want it to come out. So when they break back in with it, they don't want these other things, these loose ends out there.
Yeah.
That's why you have things like JFK records held up after 60 years, because that's a very touchy thing. If he got into their area, NASA and the UFO file, forget it, you know. And so when you hear things like, oh, the mafia, you know, they didn't want to do it because mafia killed Kennedy. If the mafia killed President Kennedy, they couldn't cover it up, you know. I mean, and they would have been prosecuted a long time ago.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make any sense. Also, things were altered in the Kennedy assassination, like the autopsy, and, you know, the media wouldn't talk about it. The mafia can't do that. So those stories never really made a whole lot of sense to me. In terms of X-Protect, I think it's a unit that's designed specifically to take the UFO file and anything that gets close to it, discredit it.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I would look at them as kind of the main players, but small group operating in intelligence circles and aerospace circles together, holding that secret, holding the wall of secrecy intact. And the problem I get into, because I deal with both deep state researchers and UFO researchers, the deep state people don't want to hear about the UFO file because they know all about government corruption and all the rest, but they don't want to hear about, you know, the whole exotic technology thing, UFOs, potentially ETs, whatever it is. But then the UFO crowd doesn't have the knowledge that the deep state researchers do. So the UFO crowd is not that deep. So only together do you get the real picture. You go from this crowd, the big advantage that the UFO researchers have is they understand there's a UFO file, there's a UFO problem. And the deep state people don't touch it, but they know the government much better. So between those two groups, if you can take the knowledge of the deep state researchers and then the ex-protect breakaway knowledge, then you'd really have the whole picture.
Yeah.
Instead, those people don't deal with each other at all, and you can't bring it in. As a matter of fact, the best Kennedy researchers I know won't mention the UFO file. But that's a big problem because Kennedy wanted to bring the UFO file and share it with the Russians. So then what do you do with that? Well, you just forget about it, you know. The CIA wanted to remove him for Vietnam or something, you know. And they had different policies, you know. Certainly Kennedy didn't want to go into Vietnam, and they did. That is, you know, a major clash, but it's not enough of a clash to remove him, in my opinion. The UFO file is, because it changes the whole paradigm. And so when we get into this period, looking back at Kennedy, I think you have to deal with the UFO file.
Yeah. How should we view President Kennedy's assassination and space program legacy without the filter of the official narrative in the 21st century?
Kennedy should be seen as someone who was, first of all, striving after freedom and disclosure. And he's somebody who came from privilege, so he understood something about sharing that you know, advantage that he had. So he wanted to give back. There's an incredible ideal inside of the Kennedy presidency. That's why he creates the Peace Corps and why he negotiates when everyone, all the generals around him are saying, just bomb the hell out of Fidel Castro. You know, he's negotiating the world away from the nuclear brink. And Kennedy should be seen in relation to the UFO file as someone who wanted to bring it out and work with other governments on it. And it's interesting because the reason he cites in the memo for sharing it with the Russians is that if they have a sighting over one of their nuclear sites, it could set off World War III, which is absolutely true. So he had very good reasoning for it, but I think it goes deeper. I think that he saw what's going to happen in the future if we keep on this way. And he's somebody who faced off against, you know, nuclear destruction. So I think that he saw space. He was like, oh, if we make space a war zone and weaponize it, we're going to have wars in space. It's going to be the end for humanity. Instead, it can be a sea of possibilities. So instead, it can be a total sea of possibilities. And he's looking out and having this vision for the future of the world. And he says the only way we can do that is by joining with the Russians and going to the moon and developing space. Instead, we got the Cold War, millions of dollars for the defense contractors. Lockheed Martin is the top defense contractor in the United States. They're making billions of dollars on space. They make billions of dollars for the Ukraine war. If there's a new war in the Middle East, they make billions of dollars on that. So they don't lose. So I guess that we go into a situation when looking back at somebody like Kennedy, he's kind of a liberating figure. And the fact that his son is running, the fact that his nephew is running in this election is just that echo, you know, whether people want to vote for him or not. He's an interesting echo across 60 years of that Kennedy legacy. So I think that Kennedy should be viewed as somebody who really gave his life trying to bring transparency to the government.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer.
Thank you.
So, will we ever get the truth from the government? The true story of JFK's assassination? Will they release the CIA records? And will the UFO file secrecy aspect be understood?
You know, it's a great question. It depends largely on the public. But no, the agencies themselves, the government will never give them the truth on it. And they had an opportunity for 60 years to do it. You'll never see it. But what can happen is those pieces can be put together by a citizen committee, and the government, certain elements in the government can give them investigatory abilities. So in that sense, you could get some closure around the assassination. But the problem is, I think, with the Kennedy assassination, and why they're even more willing to talk about other things that are embarrassing to the government, is that the records somehow of the JFK assassination strike right at the heart of what we call the deep state. And so that control structure has two aspects to it. One, at one point, the intelligence agencies turned on their own commander-in-chief. That's a pretty major story, but two, the reason that they did it. So who has the power to do it and why did they do it? This is exactly the question that you asked. For me, the UFO aspect, the UFO file aspect is crucial in terms of Kennedy disclosing it to the Russians. Now, here's where I think I get a little support for that position. We have on record the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, who was friends with E. Howard Hunt, who was the top spy master CIA guy during Kennedy's administration. Now, he got caught bungling into the Watergate Hotel and trying to steal records for the DNC. And so that's where Watergate and that whole story comes from. It's the only reason we even know this guy's name. So Douglas Caddy was his best friend. And he called him in and said, represent the Watergate burglars. And Caddy, before E. Howard Hunt got sent to prison, had a meeting with him talking about his family and what am I going to do and all that kind of stuff. And he said, before he left him, he said, before you go to prison, can you tell me one thing, like, why was Kennedy assassinated? And E. Howard Hunt said, John Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give this country's most vital national security secret to the Russians. And Caddy said, what was the secret? And he leaned forward and he said, the UFO file. So he was going to share the alien presence, as it were. That's the top secret inside the US government. And so this isn't some CIA guy telling a story. This is him talking to his friend in private. And then we have, Caddy, who is the Watergate lawyer, a historical figure. This guy's maybe 84 years old now. And we've had a number of conversations. But he's gone on the record with me on this. And so that's a major disclosure and indicates that Kennedy was, in fact, murdered over the UFO file. It makes sense. It actually brings a lot of the secrecy into focus when we have that. And so that's my conclusion on it. And then Caddy's story, and then Kennedy's memo, there's a lot of points that really point to that. So after the 60 years of secrecy, I think the thing that we can say is Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file.
Well, thank you for answering each and every one of my questions.
It's been great to be here with
Yes.
you. Wow, fantastic.
I'm so appreciative. Thank you.
And we'll talk soon.
Yes.
If anything, I think when we look at this anniversary, a lot of people are going to say to themselves, why don't they have the answers from the government 60 years later?
This is going to be a good conversation starter, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.